Before we get into today's case, I would like to thank Raycon for sponsoring today's video. If you haven't heard of them, Raycon is an innovative earbud brand that offers great designs at prices that don't break the bank, and their wireless earbuds come in a range of fun colours and patterns. Personally, I love to use mine to listen to music while I run and to concentrate while I'm editing my cases. They've become an essential item in my daily routine, and to be honest, life is just easier with my Raycon earbuds. The everyday earbuds look great, are really comfortable, and sound better than ever, with optimised gel tips for the perfect in-ear fit. And no matter how much I shake my head, they don't fall out. The everyday earbuds have an amazing 32-hour battery life and offer 8 hours of playtime. And even though Raycon start at half the price of other premium audio brands, I personally believe that they are just as good. Also, Raycon's everyday earbuds have over 48,000 5-star reviews. Click on the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/briefcase to get 15% off your Raycon purchase. Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. James Fisk was born on the 1st of April 1835 in the small town of Pownwell in Vermont, but when he was still a child, his family moved 45 miles east to Brattleboro. His father worked as a peddler and would travel from town to town selling his goods. Occasionally, James would accompany him. He preferred to travel with his father than attend school, and although he was a bright student, he showed little interest in education. In 1850 he left home and joined Van Amberg's Mammoth Circus and Menagerie. He also worked as a waiter in a hotel before returning to Brattleboro to assist his father in his business. At about the same time, he married a young lady named Lucy Moore. She was from Springfield, Massachusetts, and as both her parents had died, she had been raised by her uncle. Now, with a wife to provide for, James was even more determined to become successful. He'd always shown a great aptitude for selling, and now working with his father, he began to sell so well that he had to get his own horse and cart. A short time later, he and his father decided to enter into a partnership. Young James had great ambitions, and now as they were able to cover a greater area, their sales significantly increased. James proposed that they buy more horses and more carts and start taking on men to work for them. His father, however, was more cautious. He had always worked hard and earned a reasonable living. He was not convinced that investing his savings into expanding the business was the right thing to do. James had always been a determined character, so bought his father's share. He was now able to purchase more carts, which he painted in bright colours. He also made sure that they were pulled by the best horses. He planned out a route for each employee to take, and at the end of every week, they were all required to provide him with an account of the goods they had sold. He was then able to restock before they went out on their rounds again. By the time he celebrated his 21st birthday, James had 5 carts, visiting the towns and villages in the area, and business was booming. Unfortunately, things became more difficult during the Civil War, so James gave up his business and started working for a large Boston wholesaler named Jordan Marsh and Company. They sent him to Washington, where he arranged the sales of textiles to the government. But James always knew that doing things for himself was the way to make money, so he enlisted the help of his father in an attempt to start smuggling cotton through the Union blockade. This had been set up to prevent the Confederate States from trading. It was a risky but lucrative business. He also dealt in Confederate bonds, which he sold mainly to the British, French and Dutch. James was starting to become wealthy and was still just a young man. In 1864, he met a well-known and influential businessman from New York named Daniel Drew, who had interests in the development of the railways, as well as investments in steamships and the stock market. At this time, Mr. Drew was involved in a conflict with another American financier named Cornelius Vanderbilt for control of the Erie Railway Company, which owned and operated the Erie Railroad. This had been built with public funds, raised by taxation, and on land donated by public officials and private developers, but had now unfortunately accumulated much debt, mainly due to being mismanaged. Mr. Vanderbilt invested heavily in railways and was one of the wealthiest men in the country. With the help of James Fisk, and another gentleman named Jay Gould, Daniel Drew tried to gain control of the Erie Railway. He did this by issuing spurious Erie Railroad shares. This meant that the three men were in fact watering down the stock. Mr. Vanderbilt bought a large quantity of the shares. However, his investment lost him $7 million, and he had to eventually concede the control of the railroad to the three men. The actions of James Fisk, Jay Gould, and Daniel Drew were in fact illegal, but Mr. Gould had managed to get the stock legalised by bribing the New York state legislator. Following the threat of litigation, Cornelius Vanderbilt would later see the return of most of his money, but he was unable to regain control of the railroad. Following the Civil War, James was asked if he would be the leader of the 9th Regiment of the New York National Guard. This was a volunteer infantry, entirely staffed by men from New York City, and was only called upon when there were instances of unrest. Although James had no previous experience in the military, he was given the prestigious position of Colonel of the regiment. James would now proudly parade himself in his uniform around the city and became a very well-known member of the New York social scene. In 1867, he was introduced to a lady named Helen Josephine Mansfield, who preferred to be known as Josie or Josephine. She was apparently an unemployed actress and seemingly in very poor financial circumstances. James became besotted by Miss Mansfield and started to spend as much time with her as he was able. He bought her expensive clothes and jewellery, and eventually an elegant home at 18 West 24th. He also paid for her to have staff and a wardrobe filled with dresses. He was, however, still married, and in November 1868, 9 months after they met, the newspaper, the Springfield Republican, published an article which exposed the relationship. James was still working with Mr. Jay Gould, although both were gaining a reputation of being two gentlemen whose business dealings were somewhat questionable. This was compounded when in August of 1869 they attempted to corner the gold market. Along with a small-time speculator named Abel Corbin, who happened to be married to the youngest sister of the US President, Ulysses S. Grant, they devised a plan to force up the gold price. The US government needed to boost the economy following the Civil War, so devised a policy to sell Treasury gold at weekly intervals, which helped pay off the national debt. The three men believed that due to Mr. Abel Corbin's relationship with the president, they would be able to gain information that would help them manipulate the gold price. During the first week of September, the Secretary of the Treasury, a gentleman named George S. Boutwell, received a letter from the president informing him that gold sales would be harmful to Western farmers. He had been advised this by James Fisk, Jay Gould, and Abel Corbin. The sale of Treasury gold was then suspended, and as Gould and Fisk bought more gold, the stock price rose. However, when President Grant learnt about the scheme, he knew he had to act, and on the 24th of September, ordered the release of $4 million in government gold. The move immediately ended James Fisk and Jay Gould's influence and drove down the gold price. It did, however, cause panic in the markets, and the day was named Black Friday. The US economy also suffered, but a national depression was avoided. The three gentlemen responsible for creating this all sold their holdings before the price significantly dropped, and after an inquiry, they were not charged for their actions. Around the same time, James became acquainted with a gentleman named Edward Stokes, who along with his mother owned an oil refinery at Hunters Point on Long Island. The operation had not done well over the previous few years, but James believed that he was able to improve its fortunes. He enlisted the help of two other investors, and as well as financial support, he agreed to reduce the freight charges on the Erie Railroad for transporting the oil. It did not take long before the oil refinery profits started to significantly improve. On New Year's Day 1870, Miss Mansfield hosted an open house party in which James invited his new business partner, Mr. Edward Stokes. Edward was a very handsome gentleman. He always dressed well and was a very good talker. He also very much liked to be the centre of attention, and it seemed that Miss Mansfield was very taken by him. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Edward Stokes visited the house of Miss Josephine Mansfield. He appeared unconcerned that she was a mistress of the gentleman who had saved his business, and it looked as though the two were very fond of each other. Soon after, rumours circulated that they were involved in a relationship. When James Fisk learnt what had been going on between his mistress and business associate, he was very concerned. He had provided Josephine with so many things over the previous few years, and she had now betrayed him with Edward Stokes, a gentleman who he had invested in. He wanted to know exactly where he stood, and if they still had any sort of future together. Josephine's life had been difficult before she met James, but she was now in love with Edward, and was unsure how to continue to see the handsome gentleman and still be able to convince James to provide for her. A series of letters were exchanged between them. James would demand that she no longer see Edward, but Josephine would reply that she was unwilling to do that. Eventually, she decided that she only wanted to be with Edward and wrote to James, ending their relationship. James was not about to give up on his mistress, so decided to confront Edward Stokes. He told him that he should no longer visit Miss Mansfield. Edward replied that he would not do this, and that it was up to Miss Mansfield to decide which one of the two gentlemen she would prefer to see. Josephine said that she thought that they could all be friends. James, however, was not so accommodating, and told her that you can't run two engines on one track in contrary directions at the same time. James' next action was to attempt to have Edward arrested, and accused him of embezzling funds from the refinery. He then obtained injunctions to prevent him and his mother from entering the premises. It was becoming a rather acrimonious love triangle. James and Josephine spent the next few months breaking up before getting back together again. She could not completely abandon him, as she was worried that she may have to abandon her privileged lifestyle as well. Throughout this time, Josephine was still seeing Edward Stokes. Eventually, conceding that he may have lost his mistress, James started to spend time with a lady named Celine Montalin, a French soprano who was performing in New York. Letters between Josephine and James continued to be sent. Sometimes these expressed feelings of love and reconciliation, but others were far less generous in their choice of words. The charge of embezzlement brought by James against Edward was dismissed in court, and Edward Stokes was awarded $10,000 in compensation, an award that he did not think was sufficient. Miss Mansfield continued to demand more money from James, money that he was reluctant to pay, as he now believed that she had chosen Edward Stokes over him, but she claimed that he was holding a $25,000 trust for her, a claim that James refuted. Edward Stokes was still angry about the compensation payment following the dispute over the oil refinery, so attempted to blackmail James for the sum of $200,000. He said that if he did not pay, he would release to the press the letters he had written to Miss Mansfield. He said that these letters would prove that James had participated in illegal business practices. James refused to pay. Instead, he engaged an attorney and again took the matter to court. The court found in his favour. They then forced Mr. Stokes to surrender his oil stocks and hand over the letters. All this left Edward Stokes frustrated and in very poor financial circumstances, something he considered was the fault of Mr. James Fisk. In an effort to gain money from James, Edward then tried to sue him, stating that he was owed profits from the oil refinery. On the morning of Saturday the 6th of January, a hearing took place, but the judge dismissed his claim. A few hours later, Edward discovered that there was an indictment against him for a conspiracy to extort money from Mr. Fisk. Edward Stokes was now very anxious. His financial situation was not good, and there was an indictment against him for a conspiracy to extort money. After sitting at a table trying to think of what he should do next, he learnt that James Fisk was on his way to the Grand Central Hotel. James arrived at 4:15 in the afternoon, and as he always did, instructed his carriage driver to leave him at the ladies' entrance. He had come to see a lady named Mrs. Morse. She was the wife of the gentleman who had apparently provided James with his first start in business. He was informed that Mrs. Morse and her eldest daughter had gone out. However, Mrs. Morse's granddaughter was in residence. Mr. Fisk started to make his way up the stairs. As he did, a man suddenly appeared and shot him twice. Wounded, he tried to make his way back towards the doors, where he was seen by a gathering crowd who had been alerted by the sound of gunfire. As he fell, he was picked up by some of the men in the crowd and carried up the stairs, where he was placed on a bed. A doctor was then called. The man who had fired the shots calmly walked down the stairs and was apprehended by the hotel owner and members of the hotel staff. He was then handed over to the police. The man was Mr. Edward Stokes. Telegrams were hastily sent to the relatives and business associates of James Fisk. His wife Lucy arrived from Boston as doctors did their best to save her husband. Their efforts, however, were to no avail, and in the morning of Sunday the 7th of January 1872, James Fisk died. He was 36 years old. His body was taken to the Grand Opera House, a building that he had owned, and an estimated 20,000 people came to pay their respects, with another 100,000 gathered in the streets as his coffin passed on the way to the train station. He was then taken to be buried at the Prospect Hill Cemetery in Brattleboro, Vermont. A week later, the New York Herald published 39 of the letters that James had written to Miss Mansfield. None, however, contained anything that would suggest that James Fisk had ever participated in questionable business practices. Edward Stokes was tried in New York. He claimed that he shot the gentleman in self-defence. A gun had been found on the sofa at the hotel, which the defence team said proved that Mr. Fisk came to the hotel armed. The defence also claimed that Edward had been in a very fragile state of mind following the court proceedings that he had undergone against the deceased. The trial ended, but the jury were unable to agree a verdict, and a second trial was ordered. At the second trial, Edward Stokes was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to be hanged. However, on appeal, this verdict was overturned. A third trial resulted in the defendant being found guilty of manslaughter. He was then sentenced to serve 4 years in prison. He was released in October 1876. Edward Stokes continued to live in New York until his death on the 2nd of November 1902. Following James Fisk's death, Miss Mansfield sued his widow for the $200,000 that she claimed that he had owed her. However, she lost in court. Later she went to live in Paris with Ella Wessner, and in October 1891 she married expatriate American lawyer Robert Livingstone Reed in London. They divorced 4 years later, and she returned to Paris. She occasionally was written about in the American newspapers, but over time, the interest in Josephine Mansfield disappeared. She died on the 27th of October 1931 after collapsing in a Paris department store. She was 83 years old. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As you know, I always value your comments and feedback, so please leave any that you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.